HRN listeners. As we celebrate our 15th year, we are deepening our commitment to giving voice to the next generation of food systems storytellers, and we need your help. Our internship and fellowship programs help activate new possibilities for underrepresented and underestimated young people through experiential journalism, audio engineering, and production training. Through these unique programs, HRN helps food equity stewards build essential workforce readiness skills that expand their potential and foster economic mobility. Please consider supporting these critical programs. And with a minimum donation, you can be entered to win a dinner for two at an amazing restaurant in one of 8 cities and tickets to a concert at a great venue in one of those cities. We have incredible partners across the country who have donated, as they also share our passion for helping to educate the next generation of food systems storytellers. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. And make sure you donate before March 31st. Thank you.
Today's show is sponsored by Bob's Red Mill, employee-owned and operated, and founded on the principle of good food for all. Learn more at bobsredmill.com/podcast.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network. We're a member-supported food radio network broadcasting over 35 weekly shows live from Bushwick, Brooklyn. Join our hosts as they lead you through the world of craft brewing, behind the scenes of the restaurant industry, inside the battle over school food, and beyond. Find us at heritageradionetwork.org.
Welcome to the Grape Nation, your weekly wine journey. Our guest is Eric Asimov, Chief Wine Critic for the New York Times. We'll talk about, well, I guess, everything wine with Eric. We'll also taste an Italian red wine from Sicily for our weekly wine sip. I'm your host, Sam Ben-Ruby. Stay with us for the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We bring wine to the people. All right, Eric Asimov is the chief wine critic for the New York Times. His columns appear weekly as The Pour or Wines of the Times, in addition to his monthly wine school articles. Eric has an objective, thoughtful, and inclusive approach to wine. Eric's 2 recent books are How to Love Wine, a Memoir and Manifesto, and Wine with Food, Pairing Notes and Recipes from the New York Times. Eric, welcome to the Grape Nation.
Thrilled to be here, Sam.
We have a lot to talk about, and I hope we can cover everything. But before we get into my whole list of things I want to go over with you, I want you to frame for our listeners your background. So can you give us a brief synopsis of your journey in life and wine that got you to where you are today, which is the chief wine critic of the New York Times?
I'll try to be brief. It may not be easy.
I'll cut you off.
I'm basically a consumer of food and wine, and I have been since I was a teenager, and my parents first took me to France, and I had an extraordinary meal at a bistro that's still there in Paris, Bistro Allard.
How old were you?
I was 14.
Wow, young.
And you have to understand that I was a reluctant tourist. My parents were dragging me away. I had my first girlfriend that summer, and it just seemed, like what? It's the worst thing that can possibly happen. Your parents reassert your basic childishness. So I was, I was basically your typical disgruntled teenager, and my father was going to lunch with some buddies of his that lived in Paris, and my mother couldn't stand to have me around anymore. And she said, "Take him with you."
Oh, that's funny.
So we go to this restaurant, and of course, this is the 70s, and my parents were interested in food. They watched Julia Child, but we're still eating TV dinners and instant coffee.
Awareness,
and so on.
but not execution.
Yeah, I mean, this is what was there,
right?
And so to have this meal with the kind of thrilling, vibrant, alive flavors that I wasn't used to was it blew my mind.
So you talk about it now as if it just happened. So it must have been
I can still taste it.
It must have been that sort of life-changing.
And it was very simple food. It was an entrecôte, which is like a rib steak, and haricot vert, green beans, and dauphinoise, potatoes. And I know they probably had a bottle of wine on the table.
Did your dad let you sip a little wine?
I'm sure he let me have a sip.
Okay.
But, this... It was so good that I said to myself, maybe not as consciously as I'm saying it now, I've got to figure out a way to keep having this experience. And so I became one of those obnoxious people who couldn't walk down a city street without looking at every restaurant menu I saw. And I started reading James Beard and Jane and Michael Stern.
This is at like 14, 15, 16, 17?
Yeah.
Pretty sophisticated for a young teenager.
Well, this is, it's a defensive mechanism to make sure that if you don't have access to this food, you can figure out how to provide it for yourself. And, that became a meaningful and a meaningful objective for me, and this lasted throughout college, and it wasn't until I was in grad school.
Where was that?
At University of Texas at Austin.
Which I don't know if then, but it's not a bad food city.
It was, at that time, it was a great food city, just in the sense that you had access to Texas barbecue and Tex-Mex and all the sort of
local
indigenous
style.
regional foods. You didn't have the restaurant scene that you have there now. But you had... as grad students, we cooked for ourselves, and we just got in the habit of drinking wine every night. And this, this predated any real... I wasn't reading about wine. There was no... there was Robert Parker, but I was unaware of him and the Wine Spectator.
But that was the first time you were drinking wine with any kind of regularity, right?
Yeah. Before that, it was
for a meal,
beer,
or
whatever. But, this put it together with a meal. And I've always seen wine as part of a meal. And I had the same sort of wine epiphany down there. I was at a wine shop. It happened to be a kind of high-end health food store that... now we're all familiar with, but at this time, the only one in the nation was in Austin, Whole Foods Market.
They carried wine then?
They carried wine then, and I remember, on the one hand, you had your health food, your bins of grain and stuff like that, but you also had these
organic lentil beans,
these polished wine racks,
right.
and just completely by chance, I picked a wine. We must have been having spaghetti or something. And it happened to be by a great producer. Still only costs like $7 or $8.
Do you remember?
A 1978 Barbera d'Alba from Giacomo Conterno.
Wow.
And I mean, I had no idea, but I tasted this wine, and it was like, oh my God. It's the same reaction that I had in Paris. This is so good. I have to keep having this experience. No more of those, jug wines from
New York
the
State.
Languedoc, or we were getting
you were...
European, but they were still the cheap piquette. But so then I started paying attention to wine as well, always in the context of food. And eventually I dropped out. This was a PhD program in American Studies that I dropped out of in trying to figure out what to do with my life. I got a job in journalism in Chicago. And then
the Trib and the Sun-Times.
Yeah.
Which one was
so
it?
I was at the Sun-Times,
Okay.
and I was there for about 9 months before I got hired by the New York Times. And, it was kind of strange to me because my ambition wasn't to be a journalist. My father was a journalist, and I said, I'm never going to do this.
Well, take a couple of seconds, because you come from a literary family. So just frame that for me. Your dad was a newspaper guy?
My dad was a newspaper guy. He worked for 40 years for Newsday on Long Island.
You're a Long Islander.
He was a reporter, and then he was in all kinds of editorial positions and eventually an executive there.
You have a famous uncle?
My uncle was Isaac Asimov, the writer. And
fairly prolific.
Yeah.
And your sister.
And my sister is a journalist at the San Francisco Chronicle, where she's been for 30-plus years.
So when you were at the Trib going to the Times, at the Sun,
Times, yeah.
You didn't think journalism would be the path.
Well, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do in my life. Unlike my sister, who went to Columbia Journalism, and this is something that she, really wanted to do, I wasn't sure. I was in national news, and that's how I got hired at the Times, as a national news editor. And one of my early jobs was to be the late night editor, which meant I would come in at 7:30 at night, figure out everything that was going into our part of the newspaper, and when everybody else left at 11:30, I would kind of sit there and monitor the wires, and if something that happened had to get into the newspaper, I figured out a way to do it, or if stories needed to be updated, I did that. But often it meant I would be sitting there with not a whole lot to do. So I thought, I loved our food section. It was then called the living section.
Right.
And
do you remember when it changed to the food section?
It became the dining section in the mid-'90s,
right.
And then it became the food section. Now, this was just a few years ago. I don't remember the exact year.
I forgot.
But I thought, I've got my days free. If I can spend that time doing some reporting, then I can write while I'm sitting around, and I can sell those articles. I would get paid more as a freelancer to the living section. And so I started to do that. And I remember the first thing I wrote for them was about beer, because this was the mid-'80s, and nobody was writing about beer. And in fact, the craft beer revolution was already underway in the United States, but it was mostly a West Coast thing, and New York was conspicuously
Brooklyn Brewery
absent.
right here was in early.
Well, it hadn't quite opened yet, and I met Garrett Oliver at the time. He was working for Manhattan Brewing, which was like a early brew pub here. There was something called New Amsterdam also.
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that.
So I thought, I was just looking for an opening. I wrote about beer, and then I started writing about food, and then I guess it was noticed that I had an affinity for this, and so they moved me over to the living section, where eventually I became an editor. But what I really wanted to do was write, and back in the late 80s, early 90s, I had been pushing for us to do essentially a cheap eats column. We had Brian Miller was the restaurant critic then, and he did a great job. I loved Brian, but there was only so much he could do, and there was a lot of competition then. We had New York Newsday, which is maybe dimly remembered.
Yeah.
the Daily News. Robert Sietsema was writing Down the Hatch, which was this great newsletter.
Right. Even New York Magazine was.
New York Magazine had the Underground Gourmet back then, and I thought we really need something. And it was always sort of poo-pooed at the Times. We can't dilute the critical voice of the, But eventually, this competition was obvious to everybody, and so we had a committee, as one does back then at a newspaper, to figure out how to handle it, and I volunteered to write it, and they took me up on it. So I guess that was the end of 91 or 92. I started 25 and under.
Explain quickly what that is.
And the idea was that these were restaurants that you could get a complete meal for $25 or under.
Which usually complemented the restaurant review.
Right.
That was usually a fancy or expensive or well-known restaurant. Not necessarily cheap. Right?
As I once said inadvertently, every week I appear underneath Ruth Reichel.
Right.
Which
okay. We'll leave it at that. So you started that.
So that, and for me, that was a joy. It was just wonderful. I mean, it meant exploring the city, looking for restaurants of all ethnicities and neighborhoods that we wouldn't normally
the ethnic
go
restaurants
to.
had the best values.
I didn't really care for the word ethnic restaurant, since that seemed to me to apply to everybody.
Right.
But a lot of restaurants opened by immigrants that serving their specific ethnicity. And what really became apparent to me was that, I wasn't writing so much about food, although that was important. I was writing about culture. I was writing about demographics. I was writing about the city and the structure of the city. And this became more and more interesting to me, the notion not that we're looking at a plate simply for its deliciousness, although that is crucial, but also for how it expresses a particular culture, what its meaning and significance is.
Great.
And that was something that I learned to carry over into wine.
There's a lot of place, history, people.
Yeah.
There's a deeper story than just the glass of wine itself.
Yeah. And while I was doing this, I think I was kind of educating myself as best I could about wine. I wasn't on the beat, but I was a Frank Pryal acolyte. Frank was my predecessor as the wine columnist at the Times.
Very well known.
He
published
was
books, somewhat
maybe
legendary.
the first weekly newspaper columnist in the country, or one of the first, certainly the first at the Times.
Right.
And he did it for decades.
And you came in. You were doing the 25 and under since 92.
Yeah, but when I came over to the food section in 1989, Frank. I loved Frank. He was a great guy, and he had a kind of a aw shucks, very blue collar aspect, but he was. Super smart, well-read, spoke French,
wow.
A cultured man. And but his background was as a foreign correspondent, and I think there was something that nagged at him about spending his time writing about wine, and so he complained about it a lot.
Wow,
that
came through in your mind. I mean,
to me, he ought to be. He saw himself tramping through the Khyber Pass, and they were making him write about this sissy subject. So I once said to him, Frank, let me trail after you for 6 months or so and introduce me to people, teach me what you can, and maybe then if you are if you're just not interested in doing it anymore, I can take it over. And he didn't speak to me for 2 months after that.
He took offense to that?
I don't think he took offense to it, but I think he suddenly felt a little threatened.
Wow.
And
what year was that? Because you became the wine critic around 2004?
2004.
Was that
Well, that
right
was 1989.
Oh. That when you said that was in 89?
Yeah.
Oh, Jesus.
I realized that this was a sham, that he, loved doing what he was doing, and it was just a front.
Right.
After that, I've learned a lot from Frank.
When did he leave? Did he leave and you became the wine critic, or there was something
Well,
going
I
on?
started writing about wine in addition to
Frank.
The 25 and under column in 1999. And I believe it was 01 or so where we started the New York Times wine panel, which Frank was writing, but I was there tasting with other people. And when Frank retired in 04, they invited me to take it over.
So from 89 to 04, the threat hung around for a while. I guess. Pretty tough
I'm
guy.
actually the least threatening person you can imagine. So, it wasn't really.
Don't say
as
that.
If I was.
You're a karate guy. Don't mess with you.
What you learn in martial arts, how to avoid conflict.
Right. That's the art of it. All right. So in 2004, you become the wine critic, and we'll talk about that whole thing. But I want you to tell me, because you're probably as good a person as anybody. I want you to define, in your words, what is a wine critic? I mean, you're the wine critic, so
right.
What do you do? What's your responsibility? Your feeling? I mean,
Well, I have several roles. First of all, I'm the chief wine critic, but in fact, I'm the only person writing about wine at the Times. Occasionally, somebody else may, do a guest column or something, but for all intents and purposes, I'm the only person whose job it is to cover wine. A critic has a very specific meaning at the Times. You are an opinion writer, for one thing. You have the license to offer opinion, and I take that seriously because I don't. Anybody who writes for the Times has a lot of commercial power, whether they seize it or not.
Like a Pete Wells with restaurants?
Yeah.
I mean, is that the reference?
Not so much. I mean, it could be Pete. I mean, it could be a theater reviewer.
Right.
Whatever. What you say can have an effect on people's lives. So you want to take it seriously. But my job is, as I see it, is really to get people to think about wine and to maybe expand their notion of what it can be, what it can mean in their lives, how to pay attention to the stories that wine has to tell, not only about what's in the glass, how it smells, how it tastes, how it goes with food, but where it comes from, what it means, how it expresses the culture of a particular place and a particular people.
So it's a fair reference back to the 25 and under.
Absolutely.
Because it wasn't about picking an ethnic cheap restaurant. It was about the immigrants who came here, cooked the food, the story, and all of that. And it seems very much to carry over to how you approach the wine.
What's in the glass is important, and it starts from there. And, part of my job is to, answer the proverbial question of people on this wide spectrum of readers of the New York Times, which starts basically about, with what is a cheap wine I can pick up on my way home for dinner tonight?
Well, the Times is, you have specialty wine publications.
Yes.
Like a Wine Spectator. Then you have Food and Wine,
Right.
which covers food
Yeah.
and wine. The Times covers everything, and you're just a segment of it. So the
Right.
audience reflects that.
Yeah, so
You
what
have to keep
what
that
you
in
have
mind, right?
is a huge audience that ranges from novices who just want to know what to buy on their way home to people who have been studying wine for years and know more about their particular fascination maybe than I ever will.
Right.
So, you're dealing with this huge spectrum of people with varied interests, and I'm trying to write a column that I hope will appeal to everybody on that spectrum.
So that's a good segue to my next question, because you'll tell us about your thinking. So what is the process and I guess inspiration for how you select what you put in your weekly columns? Certainly taking that into consideration. And, I asked you earlier, but there has to be an objective to the column. So tell me about the process and what inspires you, to write a particular column.
Well, as I said, I'm a consumer. I'm fascinated with wine and food, and so I need a subject to be interesting to me.
For starters.
Yeah, and I think that if it's interesting to me, my job is to then make it interesting to other people. Recognizing that people's interests are varied, and there are people who are not interested in wines that cost more than $20, and there are other people
Collectors.
who are collectors, and that I want to appeal to both of these segments, maybe not at the same time, but at different times. So I try to vary the prices of the wine, the origin of the wine, the sorts of wines that I'm writing about. But what generally they have all in common is that I feel clearly that these are good wines that I'm writing about and worthy of people's attention. I don't want to write. I don't want to feel compelled to write about things that I have no interest in, or that somebody through conventional wisdom or repetition has decided are important, and I don't understand why it's important. I have to understand what the appeal is going to be.
So that's a bit of the process, and you said, it has to interest you. What inspires you? I mean, is it things that you've tasted? I know you travel a lot, and that's a lot of fodder for, articles. Are those the inspiration?
And just and they have to be good stories often.
Right. So the inspiration is back to what the people, the story, the history.
And so, I try to do whatever any reporter will do. I try a lot of different wines. I talk to a lot of different people in the wine and food trade. I try to travel, and that's really important. What's not interesting to me are trade tastings, mass tastings, ticking off fancy or expensive wines just so I can tell somebody I tasted it. What's interesting to me is actually drinking a wine, experieing it in a
travel to the region with the winemaker.
Yeah, that's good too. But even here, saying in New York at my own dinner table or in restaurants, you want to experience a wine in the context for which it is meant, which does not mean tasting 100 wines at a time and then
that's very
taking
fair
notes.
and reasonable. So let's take a minute here, because we talked about the process and inspiration, but every week a column appears, and there's 3 different columns. And correct, there's the pour, there's wines of the week, and I think monthly there's wine school. So
not wines of the week, wines of the times.
Wines or wine of the time? Wines of the time.
Yes.
My bad. So the pour, wines of the time, and wine school. So give me a quick description of the objective of the pour.
Okay. Well, let me start with the other 2.
Go ahead.
Because there's a built-in idea that wine coverage is going to have some sort of practical component, meaning that it's going to recommend wines that people can either buy or hope to buy or think about or have in the future, but real tangible recommendations. And so once a month I will do a Wines of the Times. This is a gathering of the wine panel for people. We taste a series of wines blind.
When you say panel, you select people?
Well, Florence Fabricant, my colleague, and I are the
panel meisters.
We're always there,
right.
And I generally invite a couple of guests each time, just for other perspectives. We taste these wines. We talk about them. We give them star ratings. We don't use a 100-point scale, but we do rate them on a 4-star scale.
You'll make about a half dozen, 8 recommendations.
Usually 10.
10. Okay.
And we'll talk about the wine, where it comes from, how it's made, what any issues that might arise from these wines, why they're appealing, or in certain cases why they're not such good buys, or why they're really why they have problems.
Right.
So that's a built-in once a month function. Then wine school, and this is an idea that I had a long time ago, before social media. I felt that the notion that reading tasting notes and scores was a good way to find appealing wines was deeply problematical, and that the best way to learn about wines was basically for people to drink wines themselves and try to keep track of them in some informal way. And
so don't be swayed by the point system or tasting notes.
Yes.
Follow your own exploration, likes, taste. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yes, absolutely.
So you're not a fan of tasting notes?
No.
And you're not a fan of blind tasting either, right?
I'm not. And I guess the analogy would be learning to cook. If you learn to cook, at first you're dependent on recipes. You need to be told how to saute something.
How much butter.
What flavorings to use, and so on. As you do this over time, you gain confidence in your own abilities and your own sense of taste, and you may never completely dispense with reading authorities, but you may feel that you know what you like, you know how to cook, you can, in a certain sense, cater to your own taste, and you don't need this sort of outside approval. And I think the same is true in wine.
I agree.
We have to lean on critical recommendations because we're not confident of our own judgment, or we just don't choose to put the time in to develop it, which is fine. But if you are interested in learning about more wines and feel keenly this sense of inadequacy, of not people say to me all the time, well, I like that wine. Of course, I don't know if it's good or not. I mean, there's this, people are always making excuses for their lack of judgment as they see it.
But what's the answer to that? If
well,
you like it and it's good to you?
Yeah. I mean, that's the beginning. If it's good to you, why is it good to you?
Keep going.
Yeah. And are there other wines like that you might also find good? And if you care enough, you can learn to recognize what you like. You can learn that maybe my own taste doesn't always correlate with an objective judgment of quality, but that's in some ways irrelevant. So I had this idea that if people could just get wines, drink them themselves, keep track of what they like and what they don't like, and then, if they bought a mixed case from a good store, then they went back to that store and said, I like this, I didn't like that, can you make another mixed case for me? And, this would be a way of learning. I wrote this in a column, I don't know, back in 2005 or so. Go forward to 2014. Now we've got, high-speed internet, widely available. People are writing in social media, Twitter, Facebook, etc.
I want to get to that separate, but
anyway, that's the genesis of wine school, where you have this. You go through the same process and have this interactive relationship with readers, where we're all. I'm recommending a genre of wine and make some specific recommendations, and then people are drinking them over the course of the month. We're all drinking them over the course of the month, and then we gather again to talk about it.
Great.
And then comes the pour, which, wine is such a broad subject. In addition to the recommendations and what it tastes like and rating wines, you're talking about personalities and economics and politics and culture and
so broad.
And, maybe there's other different things that don't fall under the category of wine school, and that I don't want to do with a blind tasting wine panel. That all comes under the pour.
So all three cover what you like to cover one way or another, or close to it.
Yeah. And, it gives me a lot of freedom, but ensures and makes my editors happy that there's real practical advice coming along with, whatever esoteric tangent I might go on.
So you have the Pour, Wine of the Times, and
Wine School.
Wine School. Those are the those are the columns you'll see every week. All right, so getting into the social media thing and all that, what influence do you think your columns have on wine? And the reason I ask that is, in the past, there were only a few voices criticizing or reviewing wine. Mm-hmm. And I didn't ask you this. Are you a wine critic, a wine reviewer, all of that? You sort of answered that, with the three columns.
Well, I just, from my own perspective, I'm a wine critic. And as we started to talk about it before, but, from this is informed opinion that I'm offering. Right. I've had this discussion with writers for other publications, and I don't think my job is to accept every genre of wine as equally good and simply make recommendations within all of these equally good genres. I have strong opinions about genres, and I offer them.
Right, because you're writing about your opinion. So with the internet and I guess blogging and all of that, it's become more decentralized, democratized. I mean, there's just, if you're a consumer, there's just access to more voices, some of them being critical.
I think this is a great thing. One of the problems in American wine culture in the 90s and the first part of this century was that you had powerful critics that were basically of one voice. Robert Parker, The Wine Spectator.
A handful, literally.
And
right?
And they pretty much promoted the same style of wine. And, you know, there were other wines and other styles were produced, but they got little attention or they were dissed relentlessly.
Yeah, I don't think the natural wine movement could have got any traction in the old days that way.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that one thing I was able to do was to offer an alternative perspective on wines. And then, you know, with blogging and social media and high-speed internet, a lot of other voices started to be heard. And I think you saw a rapid change in the sense of diversity in American wine, not only in the wine being produced, but in the audience for these wines. You know, there's still a kind of a stereotype of the American wine consumer abroad as just liking big, you know, fruit bombs,
Cali cabs,
you know,
whatever.
oaky, alcoholic wines. But
there's been a whole movement for restrained wines.
Yeah, it's I just want to say that I am totally in favor of this, and you know, one of the subversive goal of the wine school column in particular is to, you know, just in an idealistic sense, is to eliminate the wine critic as the one telling you what you should drink. There'd always, I think, be a role for wine critics to inspire, to get you to think, to take a different perspective. But maybe the more confident we all feel about our own taste, the less we need to be told what's good and what's not.
Well, it's hard not to talk about social media and where wine is going without talking about, let's say, millennials who don't even know who, like, the Parkers and some of these guys are, unless they're really nerdy guys. I mean, they get their information peer-to-peer. They get it, you know, from all these blogs and everything. I mean, have they changed the wine business? I mean,
I'm
more
going
than
to take a
baby
contrarian vision.
Okay, let me hear
view
it.
on this. I think the only thing that's different about millennials is their age. I think, and the fact that they've grown up and are more comfortable with different forms of media. But I think, like everybody else, nobody wants to be marketed to. Nobody wants to be bullshitted. Nobody wants, phoniness. Everybody wants to hear real talk, real opinion, and the advantage that millennials have is to come along in a different point on the arc of the American food and wine revolution.
Right.
Millennials have a far greater chance of having grown up in a household where there was wine on the table, or where people, cared about food.
Different exposure.
I mean, you see it just in terms of craft beer. You grow up with a certain element of connoisseurship that connoisseurship is not just some aristocratic, vaguely European notion that's applied to wine by people like the characters in Frasier. It's it's something that you've done all your life, whether it's chocolate or coffee or beer or and so wine is just one more thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have to take a quick break. We're talking to Eric Asimov. Eric is the chief wine critic of the New York Times. When we come back, I have a couple more questions that I want to throw at Eric. I also want to subject Eric to our weekly wine list. And then Eric and I are going to taste a wine for our weekly wine sip and see if we like it. So you're listening to the Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. We'll be right back.
I don't think there's anybody worthy to run this company but the people who built it. I have employees who've been with me for more than 30 years, and plus. Each and every one of them deserves to be an owner. That's just the way it ought to be, and that's just the way it is.
This is Bob Moore. He and his wife Charlie started Bob's Red Mill almost 4 decades ago. Today they offer one of the largest lines of organic whole grain foods in the country. And in 2010, on his 81st birthday, Bob gifted ownership of the company to his employees.
I'd received plenty of offers to buy my company over the years, but selling out never felt like the right thing to do. When the time comes to let someone else run this show, I can't imagine selling it to a stranger. Giving the company to my hardworking employees just feels right.
The company now has an employee stock ownership plan, or ESOP. Stock is put in a retirement plan for all of its employees. When employees retire, the company buys back their shares. According to the National Center for Employee Ownership, about 11,000 companies in the U.S. currently run as ESOPs.
It just shows how much faith and trust Bob has in us.
That's Bo Thomas, the company's engineer and maintenance superintendent. He's been with Bob's Red Mill for over 27 years and has put his 4 children through college in the process.
For all of us, it's more than just a job. And obviously, it's the same way for Bob, too.
Bob is still very active in the company. He's the president and CEO, and you'll find him working at the mill just about every day. Because when you love something this much, you want to be a part of it.
Well, I may have given them the company, but the boss part is still mine.
Bob's Red Mill is committed to sharing only the freshest, best-tasting whole grain foods on the planet. Learn more about their mission of good food for all at bobsredmill.com/podcast.
Hey, like what you hear? Heritage Radio Network has plenty more. With fresh programming every week, we've got something for everyone. Trying to start your own food business? Concerned about where your food comes from? Looking for the best wine or beer to bring to a party? Find our shows on iTunes or Stitcher, or head to heritageradionetwork.org to listen live and subscribe to our newsletter.
All right, we're back. You're listening to The Grape Nation on the Heritage Radio Network. My guest is Eric Asimov. Eric is the chief wine critic of the New York Times. I have a couple more questions for Eric, and then we'll go over the wine list, and we'll taste a little wine. Eric, I wouldn't let you out of here unless we talked a little about the organic, biodynamic, and natural wine movement, which we alluded to earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That, the critics of yesteryear wouldn't really cover that stuff. How do you see this whole movement, the wines? I mean, give me your take on what's going on with, because I think it's had some traction for the last 5, 7, 10 years.
Well, first, I would separate it into 2 parts. The organic and biodynamic, you're talking largely about the agriculture.
Right.
This is growing grapes. And I think anybody who pays attention to their food, how it's raised, where it comes from,
people who eat organic.
Yes. Needs to pay attention to the wine too, because wine is it's a good wine's an agricultural product, and if you care about organically raised food, you should care about your wine too. The natural wine movement adds to this. I mean, you're growing your grapes this way, and then in the cellar where you transform it into wine, you're making it in as minimalist a way as possible. And to put that into context, if you're talking about some of the mass market wines, the $2 chucks or whatever,
Franzia,
you're talking about an industrial product that is being manipulated to fit a preconceived notion of what it ought to be. It's a processed product, just like you're making breakfast cereal or cookies or whatever. you're focus grouping the wine, and then you're manipulating it, whether you're adding enzymes or acidity or powdered tannin.
You got into that a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
Now I think you're referring to those are kind of bad wines compared to what's available.
I think we ought to look and decide what it is. It's the equivalent of junk wine. It's junk food.
Which is
so you can
not
call
great.
it junk wine.
Right.
Now, if people choose to eat at fast food restaurants or chain restaurants, that's a choice. And it means that, food, healthy food, good food, visionary food is maybe not a priority in their lives. And the same is true with wine. So I don't question anybody who makes that decision, but I want people to make informed decisions.
But there was a mention or an argument that even that, if that gets people to drinking wine, that's a good thing. And I don't agree with it, and I think you don't.
No, I mean, I don't care whether people drink wine or not. I think, there's a lot of pleasure in drinking good wine, a lot of fulfillment, a lot of joy in doing it. And if people want to do that, I can suggest some great wines to drink. But I have no stake in the wine business. I view myself strictly as a journalist. I'm not a member of the wine trade. I'm not a booster, and I don't. It doesn't. The fortunes of the wine business interest me only as far as good wines being widely available for people who want to drink them.
So when you look at organic and biodynamic wines, there are a lot of good wines out there. I mean,
I think so, but I don't think that that doesn't guarantee a good wine.
I didn't say that.
Right. No, you didn't.
The quality can vary, and I think that may be an issue. It may be more of an issue with organic and bio. I think they've gotten better at it.
Now, the natural wine movement is an extension of this, and as I said, it's the idea that you're not you're making wine in the most minimalist way possible.
Low intervention.
And this has become a really contentious issue in the wine world because a lot of people feel threatened by the notion that people are promoting their wine as somehow more natural than somebody else's. They feel defensive about it.
Right.
They feel
calm down, will you?
And honestly, this is it's a sliver of the wine business. The notion that there's some sort of organized movement is ridiculous. Although that there are people who have acted to promote it.
There was a raw wine fair. In Brooklyn last fall.
There have been gatherings for people who are interested. But the notion that you have some sort of militant, holier than thou movement, if the people who feel defensive about it never mention natural wine, nobody would know that there are people who are holier than thou about it.
I agree with you. All right, I'm going to ask you one last thing. I have a bunch of other things to ask you, but I'll ask you this. Would you say you're a sherry fan? A big sherry?
Love sherry.
Okay, so you're the right guy. Give us I don't think people know enough or drink enough about sherry. Give me a quick primer on why people, should try it and what it is. Mix it up a little. Tell me about sherry, the virtues.
Sherry is one of the most unusual wines that you're ever going to taste. Instead of what you expect from a wine, this kind of fruity flavor, you're going to get an almost yeasty, nutty. Very unsweet flavor. It's the antithesis to fruit in a way, and yet I find it irresistible. And I admit it may be a small niche of people. The error that people make in their assumptions about sherry is thinking that it's sweet. There are sweet sherries, but most of them are not. And associating it with, an elderly relative who kept a bottle, a dusty bottle.
Right? Exactly.
And what this probably means is that you've had some bad spoiled sherry somewhere along the line. I mean, I know that's how I was introduced to sherry from my grandmother. The fact is that if you good sherry is one of the great values in the wine world, and there's been a sherry revolution in the last few years.
And it's predominantly Spanish?
It's all comes,
Spanish.
Sherry is from the sherry region of southern
Jerez.
Spain. Yes.
And how diverse are the grapes? Are there many different grapes to make sherry?
There are two basic grapes.
Okay.
Palomino, which is makes the Fino and Amontillado and Oloroso, the major types of sherry. And then there's a second grape, Pedro Jimenez, or often referred to as PX.
That's the name of the grape.
Yeah, that makes a very sweet sherry.
So tell me some good pairings. When you pull out sherry, good with a cigar, good with cheese, good with a meal?
No.
I mean, what are the...
Well, first of all, we're talking about good sherry. So you may spend a few extra bucks, but it's still... very good, and it may be an unfiltered sherry, and fall into this niche of sherries that are made with quality in mind rather than quantity. With a Fino or Manzanilla sherry, it's brilliant with seafood. If you go to a Spanish tapas bar, you may have a glass of Fino with Marcona almonds and olives. Nothing better. It's just brilliant with Spanish ham. It's great.
Iberico ham.
Amontillado, which is a slightly stronger, slightly darker flavor. It's great with poultry, with mushroomy kinds of flavors, risotto.
Earthy.
Yeah.
Great. All right, so I want people, because Eric knows what he's talking about, explore sherry a little. You know, you have an idea of what it is now. It's a very seriously made wine, and it goes well with a lot of foods.
I've written quite a bit on sherry in the last few years, so I highly recommend you Google those articles.
You Google those. And just going back, because I want to move to our wine list, have you written a lot about organic, biodynamic, natural wines?
Well, I feel like I'm always writing about wines that are made in that way.
Right. There are famous
or the
big
very
wineries
least,
that are
absolutely
organic that don't even put it on the label.
We don't always focus on the methods of agriculture, but many of the wines that I'm writing about and recommending are made with at least, if not strictly organic and biodynamic, at least some degree of sustainability.
Right. Which is really what's going on. It doesn't have to necessarily be, labeled. But to be biodynamic, you have to follow a certain...
Well, a lot of people will follow these methods without necessarily obtaining some sort of certification, which... essentially is entering a bureaucracy and paying money. And, a lot of small producers would like to avoid that.
All right, let's move on to our wine list. I'm excited to get Eric to answer our bunch of questions. All spontaneous. You don't have to go on too much. All right, so what are you drinking now? Not right now. I know what we're drinking, but are you trying things? Is there something in front of you that you're loving?
A lot of time the wines that I'm drinking are tied to a particular story. And
so what is that?
So I've just been drinking a lot of Spätlese Riesling from Germany. That's tied up with a wine school column. I just have a column on Grand Reserve Rioja. I've been drinking a lot of those.
That's today in the Times.
And, I've got some... I've said this before. I've been obsessed for the last year with Aligoté from Burgundy, and I'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks.
Is Aligoté a more reasonable entree into Burgundy?
Yes, and the thing to understand about aligoté is that it's always been somewhat despised as a thin, acidic, cheap wine fit only to pour creme de cassis and make a cure, and yet so many great Burgundy producers, the elite of Burgundy, people pay hundreds of dollars for their bottles. They make an aligoté too.
So one thing we haven't talked about is specific wine. So give me one or two producers, aligotés. Reasonable.
Aubert de Villain, who's maybe the most respected.
Romanée?
Yeah, from Domaine de la Romanée Conti.
Villaine?
Villaine, yes.
Aine.
Now, he and his wife have their own personal domain, A&P de Villain. And they are situated in Bouzeran, which is kind of in the sticks of Burgundy, and it's the one region in Burgundy where aligoté is maybe the major grape, where you have the right not to call the wine aligoté, but to call it Bouzeran, because the white Bouzeran is going to be aligoté.
So you got the best guy in one of the best regions turning out.
He's a wonderful guy, and he's making wonderful aligoté, or I should say his nephew, who has overseen the domain for the last 15 years or so.
All right, that's a good one. Give me Eric Asimov's favorite wine and food pairing. Do you have one?
Can I answer that the way Hugh Johnson once answered the question, what is your favorite wine? He said, well, the first bottle is always good, and the second bottle is even better, but I like the third bottle best.
Okay.
Listen, to be in this job, you have to love a lot of different wines, and I do. And, whether it's from Oregon, from France, from Italy, from Greece, from Germany.
Everything has a different pairing.
It's not so much a different pairing, but it's a different occasion. It's the right time for so many different wines, but I will say that Burgundy goes with a lot of things.
Okay,
and it's a great pairing.
Eloquently unanswered, duly noted. I don't want to put you on the spot, and you should be able to answer this. But let's talk New York. Favorite wine restaurant and or bar? I'm talking about a restaurant where the slant towards the wine list, the wine service, the variety. Anything come to mind to you that?
I have a lot of favorite places, and I've said so in print.
Okay.
I love the Italian wine list at Maialino.
Terrific.
Wonderful Barolo selection and Nebbiolo of all kinds. I like the Spanish wine selection at Casamono. We'll plug my friend Mateo's tapas bar, Pata Negra. He always has some great sherries there, and if you we were talking about sherries in the East Village, but I don't go to a restaurant just to drink wine.
Right.
I mean, I'm always choosing to go there for the food, and I think nowadays it's incumbent on restaurants to have really good wine lists. It's just part of the restaurant experience. So. And when restaurants neglect this, it's to their. It contributes to their own demise. They're never going to get anywhere.
I think you're right, especially if the food is, well prepared and diverse.
I went to. I was just in Bushwick the other night. And went to a restaurant that I had never been to before, Faro.
Faro's terrific.
And I really enjoyed it.
How
and they had a terrific wine list, all maybe they had one wine in the three figures, and it seemed to me perfect for a neighborhood restaurant like this. Really good food, a lot of wines to get in the $50 a bottle range, and I was really impressed.
We do the show from Roberta's.
Right.
And Roberta's, is famous for their pizza. Carlos Marachi's a very well-regarded chef and has other dishes. But similar to Faro, they have a very curated, interesting wine list. And I know you're staying here to eat, and, you'll discover that, and I'm curious on your take. All right, so do you have a favorite all-time wine? Was it that wine you tasted at 14? Is there something that changed your life?
Oh, gosh.
Birthday wine?
There are many different wines, and
see, I get why it's hard for you to give one answer.
There are many different meaningful wines, and I would say, if I have to pick one wine, I would tell. I once visited a place in Bordeaux called Domaine de Jaugaret. This is in contrast to the image of the chateau,
the castle
owned by a multinational corporation and some guy in an ascot whose job is marketing.
Right.
This is a farmer who's had his 3 acres of land in Saint-Julien his family has had it for 400 years or so. And I fell in love with his wines because, in contrast to many Bordeaux, they were soulful wines. They had the stature of a Cabernet wine with the soul of a Burgundy wine.
Now, are they available, or it's such small production?
Oh, it's a very small producer, but you can find them. They're imported by Neil Rosenthal,
who's a good importer.
Yeah.
What's the name of the wine again?
Domaine de Jaugaret. Jauguret. I'm not so good at spelling off the top of my head.
I know.
But the story is visiting this guy, and we spent a lot of time together, and I think we sort of moved from a sort of a suspicious relationship to we had lunch and sort of broke bread, and we walked in the vineyard, went back to his place, and so he goes into his it's really just like a shed. He said, I have one more wine I want you to taste. And he pulls out this wine. It doesn't have a label on it. It looks almost like a dark rosé. He said, "This is a 1943.
Oh, God!
It's my birth year."
Oh, boy!
His father obviously made the wine in the middle of World War II under horrible conditions, and he was now. At that time I visited, almost 70 years old. He didn't have an heir, didn't know what was going to happen to his estate. It was such an emotional wine. It was, delicious and still alive. And the idea that he was sharing this with me
amazing.
Just meant a lot to me. And those are the kinds of experiences you have.
It's not just about the wine. It's about the people and the experience. I agree with that. All right, you're qualified to answer this, and I didn't steal this from you, but I ask all my guests to recommend best wine around $15. And I want you to recommend a red and a white, $15 to $20. Is it hard for you to hone in on one for each? Like a lot of people say Muscadet on the white.
No, I mean, I would answer that generally by saying Loire Valley, which encompasses Muscadet.
There's a lot of good wines,
a lot of reds, a lot of whites. And I'm talking really about not the Sancerre region so much, which is more expensive, but west of that, the Touraine, Anjou, the Chenin Blanc, Cabernet Franc and there's Gamay and so on, the Muscadet.
Right.
These can be brilliant wines and always undervalued.
Let's say Loire for red and white.
I would say that for red and white. Yeah.
All right, so that's the wine list. All right, Eric, we're going to wrap up, but before we wrap up, let's taste a little wine. I see somebody familiar walking in from pictures. All right, so every week we taste a different wine on air. For our weekly wine sip this week, we're going to taste a 2014 Planeta. What are we drinking, Eric?
We're drinking Cerosuolo di Vittoria.
Which I would call Cerosuolo, but Eric had it right. Di Vittorio from Sicily. It's an Italian wine. This wine is 60% Nero d'Avola and 40% Frappato.
Yes.
Red grapes. The wine retails for $15 to $20, and it's available, at better wine stores.
Just to add, Sicily is also a great source for white and reds that are in that $17 range.
Good point. Sicily's there. All right, so before we take a sip, can you tell me a little more about the wine, the region, the winemaker? You just made a good point about Sicilian wines, good quality, good value.
The Vittoria region is really under the radar right now. The Sicilian wines that have gotten the most attention all come from Mount Etna, and of course they have a great story. You've got this volcano and Nerello de Mascalese, and very trendy and excellent wines. Fascinating region, but just a little south of that is the Vittoria region, where you have a little bit softer wines, not as tannic generally. And they belie the stereotype of Sicilian wines as big and heavy and alcoholic. These are these can be light, and in some cases even delicate. The Frappato is a very vibrant, delicate red grape. The Nero d'Avola is a little heavier. And they combine very well in these wines. And it's a small region, so you don't have a lot of producers there. But you have some great producers like Ariana Occhipinti and Coes, and some great value producers like Val del Cate. And Planeta was in the movement, larger. A little older, a little larger, and they helped bring credibility to Sicily. And I think
kudos to them for that.
Yes.
All right, so let's evaluate this. So let's look at the color first. I'd say it's a deep red.
Yeah. But it's more on the ruby end than on the purple red.
Right. The red
it's not
ruby.
Black.
Right. All right, so let's go for the nose.
You can see your finger through the wine.
Yes. All right, give me some nose descriptors.
Well, to me, the wine smells alive.
It does.
You get your kind of cherry
red
flavors,
fruit.
but there's also an earthy element to it that I like very much. And this is often what you find.
Little minerality, tobacco.
Little tobacco, but it's not. I think you might see more of that as this wine ages a little bit.
Is this a wine that you could hold on to? You should drink it in a.
I wouldn't necessarily hold on to this wine, but I might hold on to a different Cerosuolo. Right. I think this wine is a little bit bigger than a lot of them. A little. By that just you taste the alcohol a little bit more than I would want to.
Definitely taste the alcohol.
And it's a little bit more on the thick side. Where you have a lot of different versions that might be a little lighter body, a little more.
So this
flexible.
is not necessarily a classic example. So Eric,
it's not a bad example.
No, I didn't say it. So let's throw it over the tongue. So the mouthfeel.
It's very pleasant. It's
plump
drinkable
and juicy.
Right now. Yeah, it's juicy. It's not heavy. It's certainly not oaky.
What's the mouthfeel? Medium?
I would say it's medium bodied.
Medium plus. All right, give me some palate descriptors.
It's it's very consistent with the aroma. You get this
it is
red fruit, earthiness, a little bit of minerality. It's not as textured as I would like it to be. But, this is a wine that you could have with red meat, certainly, sausages, burgers.
Good barbecue wine.
How
about red sauce, Italian red sauce, or not the best choice?
Maybe not this one.
Okay.
I think, you want a little bit more resilience in the wine. This is a little bit soft.
All right, so this wine, okay, we like it, we love it. Tell me what you think of this wine.
I think it's I'm going to say it's a credible version. It's not bad.
Okay.
It's decent.
And for 15,
I can think
16,
of better examples, but for 15 or 16, it's not unpleasing.
It's very quaffable. All right, so we like this wine. That's the 2014 Planeta
Ceresuola
di Vittorio, a Sicilian wine from Italy. All right, we're going to wrap this show up. If you have a question, wine happening, or event, hit me up at samatthegrapenation.com. That's Sam at the Grape Nation. You could follow the show on Facebook on the Grape Nation page. We'll post Eric's wine list answers and the wine we drank today on our Facebook page. You can follow us on Instagram at SBenruby. You can follow us on Twitter at BenRuby. And Eric, two things. Eric has 2 books out, which we mentioned. Those are available on Amazon and at booksellers, right?
Independent booksellers everywhere.
Okay. And tell us where, if people want to follow you on social media or look for past articles, what's the best thing they could do?
The past articles, the best thing to do is just to use good old Google.
And what would you do? Eric Asimov, Rioja? I mean, that's the best.
And if you put an NYT in there, that is even better. We have a search function on the Times website, but it just is not as good as plain old Google.
Yeah. But even if you go to the Times site, I mean, if you look at the pour, there's just a list.
There'll be
it'll take you months to read
other,
the first, 15 articles. So you can catch up on all Eric's stuff
and
there.
follow me on Twitter at Eric Asimov or Instagram, and I can often sending out links to new articles.
And every Wednesday in the New York Times, Eric's columns appear. So we want to thank our guest, Eric Asimov, Chief Wine Critic for the New York Times. We want to thank our engineer, Vitor, and we want to thank everyone at the Heritage Radio Network. I'm Sam BenRuby, and you've been listening to The Grape Nation.
Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. For our freshest content and to hear about exclusive events, subscribe to our newsletter. Enter your email at the bottom of our website, heritageradionetwork.org. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at heritage_radio. Heritage Radio Network is a nonprofit organization driving conversations to make the world a better, fairer, more delicious place. And we couldn't do it without support from listeners like you. Want to be a part of the food world's most innovative community? Rate the shows you like, tell your friends, and please join our community by becoming a member. Just click on the beating heart at the top right of our homepage. Thanks for listening.